3000, QNH 1013.
Roger, head to 2000, then left 320, climb for 3000, 1013.
Viva 5216, if they land, the wind 08022.
Roger, Deadland, 050.
Announcing the arrival of British Airways flight BA5216 from Manchester.
50 years, and what to show for it. A modern airport working to the highest standards, at times amongst the busiest in the British Isles. 25 million passengers have passed through its doors, leaving or arriving. Few have stopped to think about how it all started. What else? Stories, photographs, film, memories of a gentler age when Jersey Airport was the biggest single building in the island and the most expensive, when critics said it was too big and would never be used, when the airport was a curiosity imposed on farmland in St. Peter, a place to visit with great excitement at weekend, built in 1930s style, run by a handful of staff.
What would the staff of 1937 recognise at the airport today? Well, I'm afraid not a lot. One of the two original hangars is still standing behind me and is in use as the arrivals hall. The airport terminal itself, of course, was never demolished. It's still here, just swallowed up in years of rather ugly expansion. But if you look carefully, the main entrance is still intact, give or take a few changes. Graham Dorbaum, the architect, had the idea that it would shed light onto the foyer. And fortunately, successive airport authorities have seen fit not to cover the Swedish marble terrazzo floor, over which millions of people must have walked in 50 years, either coming or going. I wonder how many of them realised that it was right here that the airport was opened on a sunny day, the 10th of March, 1937.
In the hope that this place will serve this generation and future generations of mankind, I declare this airport open, said Mrs. Babs Coutange, the wife of the bailiff Alexander Coutange, as she unveiled the Act of the States which created one of the most modern aerodromes in Europe. Before a tour of the airfield for the guests, the bailiff himself said the airport would stand to the glory of God, for the service of the King, and for the good of the people. Stirring stuff, but Coutange and everyone else on opening day knew it had taken a lot of perseverance to get this far amidst public opposition. It started on the beach at West Park in December 1933. Bill Thurgood, a coach builder from Ware, started Jersey Airways with a tiny de Havilland Dragon flying to Portsmouth. The fare, £3. The hundreds who lined the seawall were sceptical, but the company survived, Jersey's first really successful and lasting air service, even if the pilots did have to dodge the tide. It was fun in the summer, but the winter was a different matter. For pilots, passengers and ground staff, using this tidal airstrip could be a hair-raising experience. Jack Burswell joined the Airways in 1935 and went on to work at the airport for 40 years. Where once crowds gathered to wave their loved ones goodbye, we talked about the days when West Park seemed less than ideal as the base for an airline.
I should imagine it must have been quite frightening for the passengers who were travelling on the aircraft. You can just imagine southwesterly winds, rain, and seeing these waves would be a bit frightening. They had to check in, perhaps when it was pouring with rain, and it didn't help us because invariably they had to crowd in the coach with us, which meant that we had great difficulties in completing the paperwork, which invariably became a sodden mess. But we coped.
But people like Jurat Guy Fortescue Burrell de Gruchy, president of the Piers and Harbours Committee, knew that just coping wasn't good enough. A proper airfield was needed, an idea first mooted in 1930 by the Chamber of Commerce. Jurat de Gruchy took the proposition to build one on farmland at St. Peter to the States in April 1934. He was helped by Alexander Coutange, then the Attorney General, who negotiated with the farmers involved. The cartoonists had no doubts about how synonymous his name had become with the great airport project. One thing was in Coutange's favour: history. For the people of Jersey had become the most air-minded in the British Isles, from the first aeroplane in 1912, through a host of unreliable and fly-by-night air services, to the private pilots who chose Jersey for weekend jaunts. In 1933, 10,000 people had turned up at the racecourse at Don Bridge to watch a special aerial pageant. Biplanes swooped in mock battles. There was even an autogyro, forerunner of the helicopter, and the people of Jersey lapped it all up. The island experimented with various sorts of seaplanes to overcome the lack of a landing ground, but the sea proved almost as unkind as the sand, and several schemes ended in disaster when a Jersey Airways amphibian crashed on the Minkies in 1936. It brought into focus the need for a modern aerodrome, on which work started in 1935. In December 34, the states had approved £60,000 to build an airport terminal and 2 hangars, but had to vote another £17,000 in March 35 because no firm would tender for the work. In the end, Clarence Farley oversaw the job for the firm started by his father, Ernest Farley and Son.
Well, we imported I think it was the second scraper to come into the British Isles from America. And this is today be called a tiny instrument, but it was quite a sensational thing then. And that, with other equipment, we levelled the ground. We had an appalling winter, I remember. The Evening Post described it as, our father is building a seaport or an airport, which I thought was awfully clever. There weren't many people who were contractors who had done it. I know that we were the lowest tender. En tout cas, people well known for tennis courts were the next lowest. And I don't think there were any other local tenders. No, I'm sure there wasn't. Some other English firm, I can't remember who, but we were the lowest. And indeed, the committee wanted to give the contract for the landing, for the levelling to En tout cas, and for the drainage work to Farley's. And I've persuaded my father to take a chance and say, no, you'll have the lot or nothing. So we got the lot, because they didn't like to go back to the States and ask for another X thousand pounds.
But the Piers and Harbours Committee did have to go back to the States time and time again as the cost of the airport escalated. An extra £27,000 in November 1935 for night flying, which was unforeseen. £30,000 in February 1936 for special facilities, and £17,000 for levelling another 21 verges in November 1936, by which time the airport was almost ready. The opening was set for March 1937, a year behind schedule. Then the Piers and Harbours Committee announced that the official opening would be a private affair. The public would not be allowed in for fear they damaged delicate instruments. It caused a storm of protest, led by the Evening Post, which said the states had once again proved themselves hopelessly out of touch with public opinion. But the decision stood, and the public were denied the chance to see the building and all that delicate equipment. Staff were appointed. Chris Phillips was to be the controller on £600 a year. Charles Roche was the assistant controller, and Charles Roche's deputy was Jack Herbert.
First of all, the place was too large, it would never be used. Then it was too costly, and we were not at all popular. We were in brown uniform in those days, and I went into town on business frequently, and I got badgered by the public. So I used to take my uniform, if I had to go into town, I used to go in the cities. One day I went in uniform, brown uniform, and the commissioner at West's was in brown uniform, and somebody came up to me in King Street and asked me what's on my cinema tonight.
Back on the beach, the days of racing against the tide were coming to an end. For some, an airport would never be so romantic as the days when Jersey Airways pilots went for a swim between flights or hatched plots to see who could be first to land at the new airfield.
Doug Brecknell was determined that he would be the very first to land on Jersey Airport. And when he was told by the engineer, I can't remember his name, I think it was Lee, he said, oh, you have a slight oil leak, Captain Brecknell, and that was the excuse he wanted. And as a result, he landed at the airport for this oil leak to be rectified. In fact, he could have quite easily flown back to the mainland, but it was obviously that they had to put some story out to satisfy the the state's members, presumably, but he was determined he was going to be the first, and he was. And I can well remember the day because he was really highly delighted that he would beat the official opening.
Even though the Airways staff moved away from the seaside, flying was still described in nautical terms. The architects for the airport were Norman and Dorban, and of their work, the magazine The Architect said, "The buildings present both in form and colour the clear-cut, workmanlike lines usually associated with a ship. Aesthetically, this is sound, since many of the attributes of an airport are identical with those of a seaport. The consultants have striven to achieve a combination of the precise working of a railway station with the comfort to be found in a modern office building."
He had several services to Hester today, I've forgotten how many now, and to Portsmouth. But of course, our staff was not as large in those days as it is now. And we also had the same sort of weather as we get now, fog, which delayed things considerably. And we only had one watch of staff, sufficient staff for one watch. And we used to start about 5:15. And if it was fog, sometimes we'd be still there at 2 o'clock the following morning. But back again at 5:15. I couldn't stand it now.
With a permanent home, Jersey Airways could operate regular services. And for pilots, there were modern facilities like wireless and even a white strip across the landing ground to allow takeoffs in fog. For passengers, a timetable for 1937 with the new airport on the cover. By ringing the Airways at their Mulcaster Street office or at the airport itself, telephone St Peter's 200, you could book a passage to London for £3 single or £5 return. Excess luggage went by steamer, for the railway companies now had an interest in the Airways. And the Post Office finally awarded a contract to carry the mail. The first airmail arrived on the 1st of June, 1937. The Airways were striding ahead. They were first to fly the new de Havilland Flamingo, but it and the halcyon days of Jersey Airport were short-lived, as impending war cast its shadow. In 1940, Jersey Airways staff were evacuated to Donnybristle, though some came back in June to help islanders who wanted to get away. Staff at the airport got their orders, including wireless operator Bob Lawrence.
The orders we had up in the radio department was the fact that we were all had to get out of it, of course, and on no account was any of the gear to be damaged. On that, by that time there was only 3 radio officers left, which was the late Taffy Morgan, Eric de Gruchy and myself. And we agreed between the 3 of us that we would try and get the equipment away. There weren't many sets in those days for direction finding, and so we decided we'd pack it up, and with the help of Jack Herbert, who organised the Pantechnicons for us, we managed to ship the equipment away. By what I understood after the war, that we were told by Mr. Butchart that unfortunately, I think it was at Weymouth, the whole lot got bombed and it was destroyed. The ship, the lot went. That was in the harbour at Weymouth.
All your work was in vain.
Well, more or less, yes, at least Jerry didn't get it.
On the morning of the 1st of July, 1940, a lone German aircraft dropped ultimatums demanding surrender.
This aircraft came back again, and flying quite low, it went out to St Juan's and landed it from 09. So Charles Ross said, well, we'd better go out and see our new visitor. And we went out, and this aircraft taxied out very slowly to the apron with its 2 machine guns covering us, and it stopped, engine still running, and the German officer got out and pulled out his revolver and pointed at both of us and said, gentlemen, I don't want any trouble, and put his revolver back again, and he wanted to talk to the bailiff. It was Lieutenant Kern. And then at 3 o'clock, the bailiff came out, government secretary, I think Gerard Ovins, and some others whose names I've forgotten. And the airport was, or the island rather, was handed over outside of my office.
the ignominy of Jersey's brand new airport under German rule. A German soldier standing next to the sign the Royal Air Force had put up during their brief stay before withdrawing to leave the islanders to their fate. A local firm having to refuel German fighters. It was 5 years before the RAF again took control of the airport in May 1945, and this is what they found.
Oh, it was in a heck of a mess. I think the Germans, they obviously hadn't used it as an airport, because the grass was, the field was mined, and the grass was at least 2 feet high, and the place was full of empty wine bottles. I think they'd been using it as a night spot. Anyhow, the RAF were in charge, Flight Lieutenant Crombie, and first of all the engineers came up and removed all the mines. Then he arranged for some German prisoners of war to come up to help tidy the place up. And we had to struggle to cut the grass. We borrowed some mowers from various farmers and borrowed some German horses and started to cut the grass. And the crafty Germans had brought some little piece of coiled wire about 6 or 8 inches long and distributed them all over the place. And of course, when the mowers hit one of these things, the rotors jammed up, and it took about an hour to clear the things.
Peacetime brought a new airline, British European Airways, created by the Labour government, which much against the island's wishes took over Jersey Airways in 1947. In this time of ration coupons, Jersey seemed a good place for a holiday, and BEA used a fleet of wartime Dakotas to oblige. Some passengers brought their own lunchbox, not realizing that the airline served sandwiches, and the pilots and stewards often wore their old RAF uniforms because they had no other. When they landed in Jersey, they were guaranteed the sort of welcome that size means our airport lacks today.
It was such a friendly outfit in those days, what one would call a happy ship. I mean, everybody was sociable to one another and friendly. It was excellent. As we got bigger, of course, the sort of atmosphere changed, and the staff didn't mingle so readily as they did in the old days.
By 1948, it seemed that everyone wanted to run an airline in Britain, and just about everybody did. One thing they all had in common, besides often lasting only a summer season, was a desire to fly to Jersey, so that in those post-war years, the island was a microcosm of British aviation. Some of these fledgling airlines survived and serve us still today. Others were swallowed up by bigger fish, and some collapsed under the weight of regulations imposed as flying became more a science than an art. In the 1950s, when the world and his brother were keen to come here, Jersey tourism were quick to point out that the island was undoubtedly well connected.
Ever since the annual holiday became a national institution, holidaymakers have come to Jersey, the most southerly of the British Isles, to find the sun. They come by the sea routes from Southampton and Weymouth, and by direct air services from the main cities in Great Britain. And those who come once, come again.
Charming, wasn't it? But sophistication was creeping in. Jersey Airlines were, by 1962, flying the Dart Herald, setting new standards of passenger comfort 45 minutes from Southampton in a pressurized plane, so that you didn't need those boiled sweets anymore. Jersey Airport responded to the explosion of the 50s and 60s by expanding first its runway — there was a tarmac one to replace the grass in 1951 — and gradually the terminal. The lines of Graham Dorbarn's design began to disappear. It was no longer good enough to use the crow's nest as a lookout. A proper control tower and all the telecommunications which went with it was needed. Radar, direct telephone links to other major airports, more money, more facilities. In 1964, the runway was lengthened, one of the 4 times it's been extended amidst much controversy. The Harbours and Airport Committee saw the need to accommodate larger aeroplanes in the interests of tourism. In the winter of 1965, there was an even bigger job, resurfacing, which meant the airport had to be closed altogether. Getting in and out of the island meant using a special BEA helicopter link to Guernsey, and then on, by Viscount, to the United Kingdom. Passengers got better facilities too, with a new departure hall needed, if nothing else, to cope with delays during fog, from which the airport has always suffered. The buildings crawled southwards and the runway went east, prompting people to ask Lord Coutange why they had put the terminal in the middle of the airfield. His reply was simple: they hadn't. In the 60s, traffic was phenomenal. Aircraft landed at the rate of one every minute in the summer. Airfares were relatively high compared with other parts of Europe or flying across the Atlantic, but it didn't seem to discourage the thousands of tourists being disgorged into the tiny arrivals hall in part of the original Jersey Airways hangar. The hangar was shared by the airport fire service, which was also forced to expand. Bigger appliances, more knowledge required by the firemen of the inside of new aircraft using the Jersey route. Knowledge which was sadly put to use in 1965, 1970 and 1980 with 3 fatal crashes. But the biggest and most momentous change in the 60s was the advent of the jet. In August 1965, a 111 of British United pioneered the first passenger jet service from Jersey to Gatwick. BUA's Freddie Laker was on board to send the service on its way, and British United, later British Caledonian, have been operating it ever since. Jets brought all sorts of problems. Tricky landings on the airport's length-restrictive runway, to use a jargon term, and above all, noise. A society was formed of residents of St. Peter, the parish in which the airport lies. SPAD, the Society for Prevention of Aircraft Disturbance, fought long and hard, but achieved little. It has taken the long process of European law to win SPAD's battles. After years of shattered eardrums, 111s now have hush-kitted engines, and there's a whole new generation of jets using the quiet engines of the 80s. Years on, an airport that looks much like any other provincial airport in the British Isles. Still expanding, the lines of the 1937 building, which Graham Dorbarn rather quaintly described as a swallow in flight, gone forever in the interests of safety, security and size. Nearly 84,000 aeroplanes last year, but never a year to top 1975, when 94,000 movements were logged in and out. It's a seasonal airport, a hive of activity in the summer, quiet in the winter. The Lloyd Loom wicker chairs of the 1930s have been replaced with the sort of uncomfortable seats you find in public buildings the world over. Money is important in a way unheard of 50 years ago, for the airport is a trading area and has to show a profit, and the people who provide the revenue are resigned to the demands of the balance sheet and the blandness of modern travel. There is, however, still a curious esprit de corps amongst the airport staff, large as it is, especially upstairs, where controllers handle aircraft from the time they enter the Channel Islands control zone, high over the English Channel, to landing on the runway. In 1937, while the states debated whether the public should be allowed into the opening, an angry letter writer told the Evening Post that 50 years hence, Jersey Airport would be a nerve centre of Western European coastal air trade and communication. And he wasn't far wrong.
Just check on the wind, please, the temperature.
5217, runway 09. Surface wind 080 degrees at 18 to 22 knots. Temperatures +1, QFE 1003, QNH 1013.
Excellent, 013, 1003, 5217.
Alistair Lazell has written a book about the history of Jersey Airport. Called Announcing the Arrival, it has over 150 photographs, some never published before, and tells the story of the development of the airport from 1935 to the present day. Published by Channel, the book is available from leading bookshops or direct from the television centres in Jersey and Guernsey. Price £3.50.